Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Annelise Wunderlich, and I'm the Youth Participation Manager at KQED, which is the public television station in San Francisco, Bay Area, California. And I am joined today by two educators who are here to help put into context the curriculum for the film On Two Fronts, Latinos in Vietnam. I'm joined by, on my left is Eddie Lopez, who is a nationally board certified teacher, has his master's in education, and is a social studies teacher at Roosevelt High at Los Angeles Unified. Hi, Eddie.
Hi, how you doing?
Thanks for joining us. And on our right, we have Leticia Rojas, who is also a nationally board certified teacher with 10 years in the classroom at LA Unified, but is currently in higher ed teaching future teachers. And she's an assistant professor in education at Brandman University and adjunct instructor at Cal State Long Beach. Hi, Leticia.
Hi, everyone. Hello.
Great. So we invited these two teachers to help us understand the value of using this particular PBS documentary as a supplement to your curriculum in teaching about Vietnam War, and also more generally about the value of documentary film, especially in relation to teaching to Common Core standards. So to get the conversation started, I just wanted to open it up to Eddie, since you are teaching U.S. history and particularly teaching a unit on Vietnam War. Why do you think On Two Fronts and these lesson plans might be valuable to a high school history teacher?
I think the videos are really valuable because oftentimes in U.S. history we don't spend enough time, I feel, on the Vietnam War, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from that specific war that our country got involved in. And secondly, I think it's really important because the perspective from Latinos playing such a huge part in that war, I think is vital, so that, especially at the school where I teach at, we see that it was inclusive of many different folks that live in this nation and call this country their home. And so typically I think when we teach U.S. history, it's usually either black or white. And then we start to see the rise of, other people of color who have joined different wars that the American, that the U.S. has gotten involved in. And so I think this is one that I think provides a perspective that is often left out and isn't mentioned in our history textbooks. And so what better way than using video footage and interviews? So I think it does an amazing job in providing perspective and different perspectives as far as what the war meant for different folks.
Great, thank you. And Leticia, I know that it has slightly different relevance for an English language arts or other disciplines, but maybe you could speak a little bit to the value outside of social studies in other contexts.
I can speak a little bit to my work actually with Eddie. Eddie Lopez. The last, I think, 4 or 5 years when I was at Roosevelt as well, we did an interdisciplinary unit on the Vietnam, and I was able to incorporate quite a bit for English language arts, where they were learning about the causes and some of the consequences of the Vietnam War and the U.S. involvement in his course. But I was also looking at the Vietnam War and really we used a textbook and a novel for that, but looking at what were the repercussions for individual soldiers, right? And so in terms of character, in terms of just cause and effect. And I think that if you're an ELA teacher, if you're a non-U.S. history teacher, there's still quite a bit of value because you're looking at something from multiple approaches. And we talked a little bit about the importance of film as text as well. Both Eddie and I used film clips in our classes. I think that it's an incredible, valuable tool because you're looking at text as just not necessarily just the written text, right? And I think that for students, there's quite a bit of value in seeing the visual, and that has quite a bit of impact, actually, sometimes more than words do. And I think that we were able to infuse that in both of our classes, ELA and U.S. history. And I think interdisciplinary is really, really effective because students then can look at one particular piece of text or an event from multiple standpoints.
Great. So I think one of the questions that I got recently at a social studies conference was around the challenge of connecting these stories in this film to the reality that students are living today. And relevance is always a factor for teachers when they're seeking ways to engage their students and show them that connection between their lives now and history. And I'd like to hear directly from either of you or both of you about the potential for this film to help make that connection for students. So maybe start, Eddie. I know that you've actually used the film with your students, so maybe you can speak to whether or not they found that relevance.
Yeah, so far I've been able to use the trailer of the film. I'm by the time after our winter break, I'll be able to use the film in the spring, and so I'm really looking forward to that and using the modules. But even say if I hadn't looked at the modules, I think as what Leticia was talking about, as far as the power of film and how media and footage in that text, in that sense of using it for historical purposes and relevance, I think is very powerful. Even with even images, still frames, right, and analyzing those clips of the impacts and the consequences of war throughout American history. I think there's ways to analyze the human impact that it has, regardless of time, right? And I think that's one of the things that we want to get to when we talk about war. That yes, it changes in terms of eras and what country we might be involved in, but I think when we really look at the internal, as far as what a country has to think about and what individuals have to think about and the choices that they make, I think that is universal. And so that's always a way, if done right, that you could very much get students engaged in this topic.
And Leticia, in particular for Latino students, this may be something that fills a void in the traditional high school curriculum and speaks to some of the same issues that a lot of Latino students still face today. Can you speak a little more to that, or if that holds true for you in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, the school where we taught, and when Eddie's still there, and I was there for 10 years, was 98% Latino, mostly of Mexican descent. And I think that there's a couple of things. I think, one, youth are incredibly engaged with what's going on in the world now and in the past, and I think that more and more we are engaged in several wars, right, whether they're on the books or not, and I think that youth know that, and youth are curious and passionate about just the history of the U.S. and also the history of just war in general. But I think particularly for students of color and Latinos, we often don't get to see our stories told in the classroom, right? And I think that one of the things that Eddie and I focused on was bringing stories of Latinos in our curriculum, but this isn't the case in every single classroom by far. And I think that students are craving that experience of understanding that their history predates them, right? Mm-hmm. And that it might not show up in the textbook, but it doesn't mean that it's not there. And I think that whenever I would infuse that, I taught a couple of the electives that I taught at Roosevelt were also Chicano history, and students latched onto that so much because it was something that they could respond to and connect to. I also think that the curriculum itself, in terms of the educator modules that we're putting out, is also pretty relatable to students in that it's hands-on. I think that the research aspect of it, the fact that students are going out into their community and trying to find folks that have this history, I think is another added element that it's not just something that they see, that they're immersed with and they can feel it and it's tangible.
Great. One of the things that comes up is around controversial topics. One of the themes in the film that the filmmaker does not shy away from is the fact that during the Vietnam War, there were a lot of inequalities within the induction system and the draft policies in this country, and also around military recruiters coming to high school campuses, and some of the inequalities with the way that happens, especially in regards to college recruitment. And some of these issues still resonate today. And I know that this could be challenging for some teachers, depending on the politics in their district, and with even the parents of their students. This idea of thinking critically around these issues. So, Eddie, I'm wondering if you can put that into a little bit of perspective, and also Leticia, if you have anything to say about that. How do you tackle something that's still very present today and still many perceive as a form of injustice that still needs to be addressed today? How do you bring that up with your students in a way that doesn't feel really politicized and potentially volatile?
I think for myself, and actually for the past 2 years, I've been teaching an ethnic studies class, and so it's been really great and eye-opening for my students and myself. And I think one of the things when we get into these type of topics, because I think it makes them uncomfortable because of the realities that we actually face in this country. So I think looking at actual facts and the data speaks a lot to not sugarcoating the reality for students. And that's one of the things, right, that I think students find this very relevant, because when they start asking themselves, why are the percentages looking a certain way? Why are overrepresentation in some cases, especially in the Vietnam War, of Latinos and African Americans, as the film does such an amazing job as far as percentages, such high percentages going off to war. And then you see the connection between, I think the way history sometimes is taught is that, it's kind of sequential, like this happened and this happened and this happened, but it's a little more complicated than that, right? So during the Civil Rights era, you have the Chicano movement, and this film does such a great job where it brings in kind of this heightened awareness of people, and especially Latinos, and this idea of being a Chicano, Chicana, and then asking themselves, like, hey, so we've noticed all these things that exist in our society, and in addition to that, the war is happening at the same time, right? And so when we teach that to our students, that also kind of connects with them, right? Because things don't happen in isolation. So when they see it in the larger scheme of things, they start to realize, now we understand why one factor, affected the other. As far as recruitment is concerned, I think that it is really important, right? Because we do see high percentages of recruitment still to this very day. Typically in at least at my school, at Roosevelt High School, that's been an issue, and in other urban cities. And so I think it also asks the question: is recruitment at this level in other communities as well, right? And even the film, I think, brings up the point of, for some folks, that was the only alternative other than staying in their town, right? So I think these are things that people ask themselves and continue to ask themselves. And so I think bringing up this conversation through this film does such a great job as far as, some perspective, going back to Leticia's point of, is this something new or has this been happening, right? So.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that in the module that we will see in this presentation today, the film does a good job of showing multiple perspectives around these issues. It's definitely not taking, even though you can feel the filmmaker's point of view as a Latina who has, grown up in Los Angeles and experienced directly a lot of these themes. She's very also a journalist, and she's also looking at the issue from the perspective of, military service as a form of patriotism and a pathway towards citizenship, but also taking this more critical stance. And really, in my opinion, and I'm curious to hear what you think, Leticia, if the film does a good job in allowing students to have enough evidence to make their own informed opinions without feeling like there's a certain perspective or a certain political message that's being forced on them by the filmmaker.
No, I that's one of the things that I appreciated about the film. I think I was when I first joined the project, I felt it was important to also address what was happening outside of the Vietnam War in terms of the U.S. and in terms of the Chicano movement. And so there was this there was this group of folks that were organizing and Eddie spoke about that that did acknowledge that people of color, particularly Latinos and African Americans, were being sent to the front lines before anyone else, right? And so when I saw, and that's the module you're going to show, but that there is that perspective, and that students are able to see this film from multiple standpoints, right? That this idea of joining the military, still now to this day, I think it does have a strong connotation of patriotism. For a lot of Latinos, it's something that they're very proud of, this family legacy and history of serving. And so I don't necessarily have that in my background, but I think for me it was also, that's important to acknowledge and to acknowledge the contributions that Latinos have had in that, but also to acknowledge the other standpoints that, we can critique something, and I think it's important to have a critical perspective on that. I think it does a good job, and I think it's used as you have to, as a teacher, you have to supplement things, right? And so we have the curriculum and you have the film, but I think there's also a lot that has to happen in terms of educators ensuring that multiple viewpoints are acknowledged and that students are able to take all these different things and then make up their own opinions, which I think is what education is about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So another thing that comes up sometimes is that for teachers who do not have a large Latino population, they wonder, about taking the time to spend in integrating this film into their curriculum. So maybe you can speak to that just briefly, because I know we're starting to run on time here. But if you could just, either one of you, speak to the value that the film might hold in a school or a classroom where there's not a lot of Latino students.
I would say that what the modules do and what the film does, I think gets to what the three of us, or actually, with the fourth member as well, what we had planned was, kind of what can we get from the entire film if someone were not able to watch the entire film, which we recommend everyone to do, but what can we pull from it to leave these modules, but these experiences of providing a new perspective, especially in communities where there aren't high populations of Latinos, so that they could see that other perspective that Leticia and I think the film does such an amazing job. Like I said before, right, I think this is one of the first and only films that I've ever seen entirely on the Latino experience in American history during a war, especially, right? But chronicles the story of Latinos from World War II up to the point of Vietnam, right? And so there's just so much as far as how it could be used for Latinos and Latinos during war in the 20th century. I would also like to say that in one of the meetings that we were all in, where we met with veterans from different wars, Latino veterans, I'll never forget one of the individuals who was a very outspoken veteran who said that one thing that they were really upset with the Ken Burns PBS Vietnam series was that there was no mention of Latinos, or if there was no interviews or narrative of the Latino experience. And that, right, should not happen, especially when Latinos made a huge portion of the folks in the front lines. And so I think that regardless of what community one lives in, especially for this war, this is one perspective that needs to be looked at. And like I mentioned, right, typically we see it as just black and white, but rather like what are the other people of colors, people of color experiences. And so I think the modules, I think, do a fine job in, at least if someone were to say to themselves, I only have this amount of time to cover the Vietnam War. I do want to provide multiple lenses and perspectives on this war. What can I pull from this film? And they could actually pick and choose, just like Leticia mentioned, they supplement it, and so therefore they can pick and choose which modules they feel fit better for their classroom. But definitely any one of those would make a great addition to anyone teaching war, or how the modules are broken down. So even the Vietnam War, or how it transcends, right, war into society, or it boils down to just a story like the first POW and his sister, right, and what that meant for just a personalized story of a brother and sister and how torn they were throughout this war.
Which is a universal thing that affected American families all over,
Exactly.
across ethnic lines, right? That some members of the family might have been critical of the war and others served in the war, and that created like a real conflict for the American public overall, I would say. And just to clarify, Eddie, the Ken Burns film that I think caused so much controversy was about World War II, I believe, and he's now...
I thought he said Vietnam.
No, he's working on a film about Vietnam, which I think is going to come out in 2016, and I don't know what the content of that is, and I bet you that there will be a strong Latino perspective based on all the backlash that he got, rightfully so, from a lot of communities of color, not just Latinos, about the representation in his World War II film. Just to conclude, if you guys could just briefly touch on, for teachers who are strapped for time and teaching to the test and, stressed out with trying to understand Common Core standards, how does a film like this and documentary film in general, you already talked about this a little bit, Leticia, just the value of documentary films overall as an alternate form of text that's important. But if you guys could just put this into perspective around teaching to standards and the value that a film like this has for teachers who are worried about that.
I can speak to a little bit of it. I think that one of the things that the film itself, but also what we spent quite a bit of time in terms of the lessons and working with you, Annelise, in terms of making it Common Core aligned, right? And so you have the U.S., the social studies standards, and I think a lot of the ELA kind of standards fit in nicely, but I think that a lot of the work behind the modules is incredibly Common Core. You're having students, again, we keep talking about multiple viewpoints, but I think that that's really a huge Common Core focus, right? You also have this idea of students as researchers and owners of their own education. So I think that this really puts the onus on learning, yes, on the teacher, but more importantly on the students, because they are having to take in this text, which is visual, which I think is incredibly important as well, and having to make sense of it in terms of what the Latino history in the Vietnam War was. I think for educators, we're always tasked for time. It's always, we always have new standards. We always have new educational reform movements. And I think that as educators, we know that. But I think that this film, if I could say anything about it, it would be that the curriculum was developed by educators that have been in the classroom with that perspective in mind. And so I think that that's important, that we also knew that folks are pressed for time. And so taking that into account and taking into account what was the most important things that really could latch on from the film.
Okay. And Eddie, I don't know how familiar you are with the C3 framework that the National Council for Social Studies is pushing out there. I think it's, I don't have it in front of me, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it myself, but we worked hard with David Basso of the National Council for Social Studies to make sure that we're aligning with the C3 framework. And I think the big thrust of that is that it's inquiry. We tried to encourage the spirit of inquiry throughout the lesson plans and making sure that students are developing their own questions, and a lot of the activities are designed to allow students to explore the topic through their own lens. So I don't know if you just want to add a little bit about that inquiry-based model that we tried to work with.
Yeah, I think the module that focuses on that, right? I think that's really important because it's one thing to discuss it and write about it in the classroom, but then kind of what do you do with this information, right? So that kind of like how do we honor, and that I like the fact that it's broad enough to hopefully include all students' perspectives. As far as their opinions based on after spending X amount of time studying the Vietnam War, right? Where I think that changing our students from just learners but to civic agents, right? Mm-hmm. And this agency that they take upon, which our country promotes so much, and so kind of taking it outside the four corners of our classrooms. And then having them decide on how they want to honor, folks who have served this country, or honor the idea of, what it means to question our government and the choices that it makes, right? And so I would just want to add that's one of the things that the educators that came together to really work on this wanted to make sure that there was some meaningful project that the students could leave with to really reflect on, because I think that's part of where being an educator is exciting, because those are the memories that years from now, right, that some will say, I remember when we went out and we actually talked to the veterans at the vet, right, at the veteran hospital. Or I remember when we, heard stories from, even say if we're talking about, Vietnam, maybe the refugees who live in our communities that came out of this war, right, and this helped me connect to those neighbors, right? And so it was through that project, and maybe those experiences lend themselves to them, wanting to develop more questions in the future that we want them to think about as they move on in our society, and when things like this happen again.
Great. Well, I feel like we could go on and on, but this I think it's time to wrap. And I just want to acknowledge again the wonderful contributions that both of you made to developing this curriculum and really infusing it with the realities that teachers face in the classroom, trying to integrate content like this into their curriculum. I also want to just acknowledge two folks who are not here today. As I said, David Basso, who teaches history in Connecticut at Berlin High School, and has worked a lot on the C3 standards with the National Council for Social Studies, and also Tony Saavedra, who is an ELA teacher in LA Unified, now retired, but had a long and distinguished career as in particular, a media studies educator in Los Angeles. So thanks to this amazing team, and thanks for joining us today, Leticia and Eddie, to share your perspective and your wisdom with the folks who joined us today.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to